Welcome, everybody. My name is Jonathan Friedman, and I am pleased to welcome you to today's webinar on connecting with the good and other strategies for facing potentially morally injurious events. For those of you who are longstanding attendees of our webinars, welcome back. And for those of you who are new to EH in Canada, we are a leading nationwide network of treatment centers for addiction, trauma, and mental health. We offer inpatient services with centers coast to coast, as well as intensive outpatient and virtual options. For more information about the work we do, visit our website at ehncanada.com. Everyone is on mute and cameras are turned off for today's webinar, but we'd like you to use the Q&A box right at the top of your screens to submit your questions for our speaker throughout the session. Some people in the past couple of webinars have said that the Q&A does not work. If you put your questions in the comments, I'll make sure to get to those as well. We will be sending a follow-up email in the next week that will contain a link to the recording of today's session as well, so stay tuned for that. To stay updated on our future webinars and newsletters, we invite you to opt into our mailing list by filling out the form that has been linked in the Q&A chat. Our speaker, Dr. Krystle Martin, and I are both located in Toronto, which is on the traditional territory of several nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. It is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. If you are new to this work and want to find out whose land you are on or grew up on, please visit www.native-land.ca. Now, a little bit about our speaker today, Dr. Krystle Martin. They're a licensed clinical and forensic psychologist. Dr. Martin provides psychotherapeutic interventions and comprehensive psychological assessments for adult clients with a range of clinical and forensic issues. However, she has a particular interest and expertise in working with first responders. This brought her to support EHN Canada, and in particular, EHN Guardians Gateway and EHN Guardians Atlantic, two sites that are dedicated to treating first responders and active/retired military personnel. At these sites, she provides consultations to staff and supports program evaluations and research efforts. In addition to supporting EHN Canada, Dr. Martin is the director of a private practice and regularly provides consultation to first responder organizations to advance their wellness initiatives. She is also an adjunct professor at Ontario Tech and York Universities, where she teaches and supervises graduate students. My friends, without further ado, I will hand it over to the incredible Dr. Martin.
Amazing. Thank you, Jonathan. That was quite the introduction. And hello, everyone. It is very exciting to see where everyone is coming from. And we're all across Canada and otherwise today. So that is very exciting. So again, thank you for joining me this morning. I am going to share my screen so that you can see my slides. If people are interested, I'm happy to share my slides. As you will see, there's not very much on my slides, but again, you are welcome to have them. And like Jonathan said, there will be information that they will follow up with. So if there's any links that I talk about or any other resources, hopefully we can send them your way as well. Like Jonathan mentioned too, that if you do have questions as we go along, you're welcome to put them in that Q&A box or in the chat. And I have absolutely saved time at the end. I think that part is really important. So I have practiced this presentation to make sure that there is a dedicated time for us at the end to have any comments or feedback or any questions for me. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so we should be there. So today we are going to be talking about moral injury. And like the title suggests, though, what I'm really hoping that we can focus on is thinking about how do we intervene with folks who present with a moral injury or moral distress. I'm going to be using a variety of different terms. So in a second, I will define those terms. So whether or not people have a full injury or they're presenting with symptoms of this construct, my hope is that today we can talk a little bit more about the actual interventions and how you might do the processing or how you might adjust your approach in therapy or in just your interactions with people to better support folks, again, who are presenting with traits of this. So just to set us up about what I will be talking about, So the agenda for my talk is first, like I said, I'm going to talk about some definitions and review some terms so that we are all on the same page. I will very briefly discuss some of the literature of what we know about moral injury or moral distress, but really that's not going to be the focus today. And then, like I said, the real focus is going to be on talking about and considering how do we treat folks who present this way? What are some important clinical considerations? What are the identified treatment options? Again, and maybe even what I have, and you'll see in a second, above and beyond sort of the traditional empirically based treatments. So, what are some other things to think about? And then I have added a model that has been proposed. It's not specifically looking at how do we prevent moral injury, but it's a model of proactively protecting ourselves for folks who work in a public safety occupation, which really is the focus of much of my clinical work. And so I thought I would share that today because I do think it could be helpful in reviewing. And then, like I said, we absolutely will have time at the end for any questions. Okay, so what are we talking about? And again, whether or not you are new to this concept or whether this is something that you've heard before, my hope is that we can make sure that we are all on the same page. So essentially, a moral injury or something that is morally distressing to us is something that happens. So it is an exposure-based response to something that influences us sort of on the level of our soul or what it means to be a human. So it goes against our morals, and it could be something that we ourselves have done, or it could be something that someone else has done to us, or something we've witnessed that someone has done. So again, like other conditions, it is an exposure-based response to something. And really, it's, these terms come from different literatures. So much of what we have called moral distress comes out of the healthcare literature, whereas moral injury is really a term that came out of the military. And rather than seeing these as different or conceptually different constructs, really what I think is helpful to consider is that these are on a continuum. And so what this slide shows is that perhaps when we are faced with something that is, they've described here as a challenge, so it challenges our morals, it might lead to something called moral frustration, right? So we're frustrated about something, it does impact us. Whereas as something gets more difficult, so now instead of just being challenged by something, it is now stressing us, that could lead to moral distress. And then certainly if something is a morally injurious event, that could lead to an injury. Now, what we do know, just like other exposure-based challenges, that just because you have been exposed to a challenge or a stressor or an injurious event doesn't mean you will for sure go on to experience these things. These are just potentially injurious or potentially stressful. And that in fact, humans are quite resilient creatures, and that most people who are exposed to these types of situations do not go on to develop distress or injury, but that certainly there are a handful that do. Now, whether or not someone has a moral injury could be because of that seriousness of the event, but it also could be about how often, the frequency with which something is happening. So if you are exposed chronically to things that are morally challenging or morally stressful, it still could lead to a moral injury. So it doesn't have to be as serious per se if the frequency is high. So I first came across this term several years ago at a military conference when a soldier was describing his experience of he was the person who drove a tank, and he was given the order that he had to keep driving no matter what, and meaning no matter what was in front of him, even if it was a child or an animal or something like that. And he had been describing in his presentation that this really felt morally injurious, that while he understood the the risks that they were facing, that it really felt like it was going against what he had signed up for in his deployment. So at that time, I was quite, it was interesting because I really took that information and went back. I was working at the time in a forensic unit with people who had been found not criminally responsible for their crimes. And there was a gentleman there who, in no other way than I could describe at the time, because I didn't have the language yet, is I described that he was in shock. So he literally walked around the hospital. He was doing like 40,000 steps a day. He experienced a lot of guilt and shame for what he had done because essentially he had tried to kill his family, and it was very, lucky that everyone survived. But despite that, when he became well, when he accessed treatment and medication and had was told what he did, because he didn't have a lot of memory of what he did when he was experiencing the psychotic episode, that he could not believe that he had done that. And so of course, that was a traumatic event, but it was also incredibly morally injurious to him. And he basically shunned, away everyone around him. He felt like he didn't deserve to see his family again, despite them being willing to see him. And it really was because of this initial presentation that I had the language to describe, oh, I think this is a moral injury. Now, certainly these are both very extreme examples, and so I would call these morally injurious events that certainly did lead to moral injury, but I'm sure that many of you can think back to even things like the pandemic really brought out a lot of moral challenges and moral stressors, and even potentially morally injurious events that you can relate to and think about in terms of your own, again, experience. And so where it falls along this continuum leads to different language. And so part of why, again, I think it's really important and we'll talk about this later in my presentation, is to keep talking about this, is to give language to people's experiences, right? And that, again, certainly informs the clinical interventions that we will do. And I'll talk about that in a second. So what does the research say? So this is, again, going to be a very brief overview of what the research shows, of what we know. So before I jump into some of the results, what I did want to really acknowledge is that much of what we know is couched in sort of a Western world, Christian, religious, or spiritual conceptualization. It really is heavily focused on our medical model and approaches. Plus, most of, again, the research has been conducted, has been heavily influenced by a military culture, which means also that most of it, again, is reported, or participants have been men. And so, again, while all of this is incredibly important and specific to the world of the military, when we try to apply this outside to other populations, to other occupational groups, to other genders, really more research is needed and necessary to be able to generalize some of this, what we do know. But for example, when we look at who is at risk of developing a moral injury per se, when we think about, like I said, this is an exposure-based response, that the most potentially morally injurious events, as they're described in the research, are events that involve children. But the most prevalent seem to be when someone feels betrayed by another person or by the organization that they work for. In terms of like internally, when we look at who reports more symptoms of moral injury, those tend to be people who also report having high empathy or perhaps have a personal connection with the victim. It is also people who report having their own adverse childhood events. And then in an occupational environment, people who report having high workplace demands with low staffing and low support from their employer also tend to report more symptoms of moral injury. When we look at prevalence, Again, like I said earlier, that most people who are exposed to a potentially morally injurious event do not go on to develop a moral injury. Again, we also have very little Canadian data, although that is growing. This has certainly become an area of greater interest in the last several years. In the US, again, in the military, we see that about a half of active or retired military folks do report symptoms of moral injury. If we look in healthcare, that rate is a little bit less at about 40%. In Canada, it's hard to find percentages of prevalence, but what we do see is about 65% of Canadian Armed Forces members do report having an exposure, and that of those people, the folks who then go on to develop symptoms tend to have experienced their own military sexual violence, like I said, an adverse childhood event, um, and also tend to be in a rank of a more junior role in the military compared to more senior members. Like I mentioned earlier, the pandemic really brought out this issue around moral injury or moral distress. And in Canada, there's been some research looking at respiratory therapists, which certainly would have been heavily involved in the treatment and intervention of COVID. And about 25% of them report that after COVID, they were considering leaving their job because of the moral distress that they were experiencing. When we look at outcomes, of people who do report a moral injury, we see that they're much more likely to develop PTSD, depression. They have poor health outcomes compared to folks who do not have a moral injury. And that if they themselves were the perpetrator of the event, um, this is linked to higher suicidality, substance misuse, and again, higher levels of depression. Again, much of this research, like I said, is in military populations. More is needed in civilians or other groups. And so, uh, people have missed out on other populations. So again, I'm not sure whether or not this is entirely generalizable, but it certainly is what we know to date right now. So I'm going to go on to talk about intervention. And whether you're doing psychotherapy or you're doing case management or you're doing some other healthcare role with someone, I think all of this applies. And this first screen that I'm going to be talking about is really just things to think about when treating someone who either presents with the full moral injury or perhaps someone who just has said, "Hey, I've been exposed to a potentially morally injurious event." And so some things to think about in terms of your approach. So, of course, therapeutic alliance is important with every interaction we have with clients. But if we think about moral injury in particular, that most of this, what people are being impacted by, are events that are interpersonal in nature. And so, whereas, in PTSD, you could have someone who got in a car accident, with moral injury, it's more specific to interactions that people have between people or between themselves and an organization. So that therapeutic alliance is important because things like trust, respect, um, are have really been impacted even more so than perhaps in other clinical presentations. And so developing and focusing on the therapeutic alliance becomes even more essential in that relationship. And part of that is about going slow. So, again, if someone is presenting with depression or anxiety, again, those, while they could have interpersonal, difficulties in those experiences, again, because moral injury is mostly an interpersonal injury, developing that therapeutic alliance and moving someone through the treatment process is likely to be a slower process here. It is really important for clinicians to know about moral injury. So, what I often see in practice is that someone comes to me not saying, "Hey, I think I have a moral injury," or "I'm experiencing moral distress." What they come to me is with a handful of symptoms or struggles or thoughts that they have. And it's like I'm sort of able to kind of peek in and say, "Oh, I actually think this might be, something called moral distress." And then it's me giving education and language to the person that shapes the struggles that they might be having. So again, like I said, most people aren't coming in talking about this. And so this is where I think we've kind of missed the opportunities sometimes to treat folks with moral injury because, again, it's a new term. Not everyone is fully aware of what it means and what we're talking about. And so I think we've missed some of those, but it also, I think, is validating to folks when we're able to label something. Labels aren't always good, but in some cases, they absolutely are validating and normalizing when we're able to provide clients with that information. It also is incredibly important because, like we'll see on the next slide, there are other interventions that could be effective when treating someone with symptoms or a full injury. And so if you are not aware of those, again, that's where I think we might be not serving people in the way that we should. Again, continuity of care is always important, but again, because of the interpersonal nature of moral injury, really taking care to make sure that someone doesn't fall, through the cracks and that there aren't gaps in services, taking care to do really thoughtful handoffs if you do have to pass on care, I think is incredibly important. And then also keeping in mind that while some of the thoughts and some of the experiences that people have related to their moral injury could be pathological or distorted or all of these other words that we use, that many of the times, their distress is based on facts. They could have done something awful. They could have experienced or witnessed something that was very awful and that actually is just a part of, sort of the human condition or, something that naturally would have happened. And so not all of people's responses are something that we need to pathologize. We even think about that with PTSD, that again, this is an exposure-based response, and that, in the first month, of after a trauma or after a potentially morally injurious event, we might tell someone, all of these responses are completely normal and expected and part of trying to recover. And it's really only if they get stuck or if they continue or really intervene with or interfere with functioning does it become something that we need to intervene with. And so we do need to be careful that how we are approaching and conceptualizing the symptoms of moral injury. And then, what I'm describing here is more about the process and the atmosphere of the treatment approach rather than the actual intervention. Because things like these, our current evidence-based interventions that we are using for things like post-traumatic stress disorder is really what we have been the go-to with treating someone with moral injury because of the overlap with that kind of exposure-based response. That those evidence-based interventions do show promising outcomes for the most part, although not for everyone. So things like cognitive processing therapy, EMDR, prolonged exposure, all of those could be applied to someone with symptoms of moral injury. It's just about how do we tweak it slightly, because again, if we think about PTSD as a lot of an anxiety-based response, the moral injury tends not to have that it tends people are presenting with anger, with a sense of betrayal, with shame and guilt. Again, certainly some of those are part of the PTSD presentation, but it's less so about a more hypervigilant or overly activated physiological system. So there are some ways of how do we tweak what we already have to better support folks with, who present more closely to a conceptualization of moral injury. Okay, so like I just said there, I do think that the more traditional and evidence-based programs that we currently use for things like PTSD can be applied and have attempted to do research to show how effective they are in a moral injury population. But what I'd like to focus on is sort of what else? What else can we consider? What else do I think is important? And what are some of the research showing in terms of impact with people presenting with either moral distress or symptoms of moral injury. And so the first one that I have here is connecting with goodness. Now, this is not a term that you will likely find in the literature. It's sort of just a word or a set of words that I use myself. And where this comes from and why I think this is important is if we step back for a second, that one thing that especially chronic exposure to morally challenging or stressful events, what that leads to in people, one of them is something called an availability bias. And what this is a bias that develops cognitively where people, it's kind of like a lens of how people see themselves, how they see others, and how they see the world around them that shapes how they make decisions, which ultimately impacts their mood and how they feel. The idea is that if something can be recalled easily, so if it's available to our mind easily, then it must be important. And what tends to stick in our mind are events that are recent, that are frequent, that are intense, and that are negative. And so, again, for folks perhaps in an occupation that have chronic exposure to difficult and negative events, then there's this availability bias that pops up, and they use that information to shape, again, how they see the world. And so, where connecting with goodness comes in is we need to counterbalance that exposure. So if they, again, if their job, if their world, if what's around them is constantly negative, intense, difficult, how do we provide folks with a counterbalancing to expose them to good things in the world, to remind them that people essentially are good, that the world has positive or even happy moments in it. And this isn't about necessarily creating those moments, but even just shifting attention. And this is where, you could encourage people to actively connect with goodness. So it could be things like seeking these out. So how do people arrange their social media? I know for myself, I don't follow, like news accounts on Instagram. I follow like cute puppies and flowers and tiny homes, right? So I on purpose and explicitly look for and seek out the goodness in the world. So it could also be encouraging people to do things like volunteering with organizations that they feel good about. It could be about going out into nature because that typically feels good and reminds us of nice things in the world. It could be connecting with pets or children, so things that are innocent and cute and make us laugh, right? So part of connecting with goodness is about counterbalancing what is available to our mind, and it could be about more actively seeking it out. The other part, though, and which is a lot easier, is just about helping our clients or helping folks we work with to just shift their attention. So, again, when people are working in environments where they're unsafe, where they're negative, where they're intense, their physiological system tends to become a little more hyperactive, and it could lead to a symptom like hypervigilance. But it could also just lead to, a bias in terms of what we attend to. Humans, we have a negativity bias. We tend to focus on things that are negative in an environment, mostly from a survival point of view. But what unfortunately that leads to is what we remember. So we only remember what we pay attention to. And how we feel at the end of the day or at the end of the week is dependent on what we remember. So our mood depends on our memory, and our memory depends on our attention. So helping clients to redirect their attention to what else is true. So what else is true in their environment? So even if they are chronically exposed to things that are morally stressful or morally challenging, to not to avoid those things or to say that's not happening, but it's kind of like, how do we just shift, to kind of zoom out of that experience and say what else is true in that moment, even if it's not good, even if it's just neutral, if there's a minor part of it, that sliver of goodness, what else is true in those environments? So again, this doesn't require them to seek out anything new or different. It just requires them to just, again, shift or redirect their attention. So a particular activity that I like to give to clients for homework is something that I did many, many years ago. Um, and it's, I'm sure we've all heard of this. It's sort of like at the end of the day, write down 3 things that made you smile. Now, the reason why I use that is because typically people do this about gratitude. Um, and that's fine. You could use the word gratitude. But I want it to be even smaller, like just a tiny moment. Like, what are 3 moments in the day that made you kind of smile or that were kind of good, even, and get them to write them down. I find it helpful at the end of the day because then what happens if you assign this for, let's say, a 3-week period, is that as the days go on, your clients or people will start to think about during the day, ooh, what am I going to write down tonight? And they'll start to think about it. Or they will look at something and say, ooh, I'm going to write that down tonight as part of my list. And then over 3 weeks, what you are doing is you are shaping what they're paying attention to. And then, like I said, what they're remembering. And basically, you are training the brain to focus on the other parts of the environment that are kind of okay, or that maybe are even good. And then at that point, it becomes habit. And so I have certainly really benefited from this practice myself, where I naturally go throughout the day. And for me, things that make me smile are things like sunrises or sunsets or seeing a bunny on the lawn or something like that, or seeing my kids do nice things for each other. And so I'm able to pause and notice and pay attention to and then remember these parts of my day that I'm not in control of, that were always there anyways, but influence my ability to connect with goodness, to counterbalance the difficulties that I might have in my day, and to perhaps give my brain something else to consider when I have that sort of cognitive process of how do I see the world? How do I see others? When, especially if I'm exposed to potentially, morally injurious or morally stressful events. So that's something that I would encourage you to think about, this connecting with goodness. The next point there I have on the screen is about awe. And what I actually want to talk about is something called the overview effect. And so what the overview effect is a term that comes out of research looking at astronauts, actually. And so what they did is they interviewed astronauts when they come back to Earth, and what they were noticing is astronauts were all describing a very intense emotion when they reported seeing the Earth, the entire Earth, like the whole planet, that it was a mixture of gratitude, of complete awe of this amazing place, of seeing how small the Earth is compared to the whole, universe or solar system, and that as a result, how small they are, as being part of that, but also being part of that is their home, that is where they come from, and that they're part of this really amazing, beautiful place. But that given how small they must be, because they see the whole Earth just through, a window, that they have also described this experience that nothing really matters. Not in a nihilistic way that nothing matters, so who cares, but in a, really my role on Earth is so minute and small that they experience almost like an ego disappearance. And all of these put together, I'm not going to talk about this, but all of these put together remind me of what is described when people are doing psychedelic assisted therapy. But it seems to be a very similar experience of letting the ego go, that things don't really matter, but in a lovely, very relieving way, and that they have this intensified gratitude and awe for where they come from and really feeling part of something. So, as I describe that, you can see perhaps how if someone is experiencing a moral injury or moral distress, they typically are socially isolating themselves. They might feel shame, they feel detached from others. And so part of the recovery is about reconnecting with the world, letting go of their ego and their own self-importance, given sort of the intensity of what they did, if they perhaps have perpetrated something, and not to say that it doesn't matter, but to have some perspective. It also helps people to appreciate what we do have. And so, of course, we can't all go into space. So how do we do this? So research has shown that people can experience this overview effect if they basically do something that allows them to experience gratitude and awe with a visual cue all at the same time. So they've looked at people who've climbed mountains, but even just have been in nature where they, are on a hill or a beautiful expanse, like kind of like in the prairies or something where it's just so awe-inspiring that you can see forever, or a really amazing, beautiful part of nature. And so perhaps there's activity that we could give our clients to encourage them to experience this overview effect, which hopefully will help them to, experience all of those things that I mentioned that the astronauts feel. All right, the next bullet there is around self-compassion. So again, like I said, if people, particularly if they've perpetrated the event that they're describing as difficult, or if they're struggling with something, how can we support clients to, give what they often give much, easier to others? Can they give that to ourselves or to themselves? And so maybe Kristen Neff's work in self-compassion could be a direction that you look at in terms of supporting clients to experience this with themselves. So, social connection, I'm sure, is not a surprise given everything I've just said around how morally stressful events or injurious events are often interpersonal in nature. And so, reestablishing a community or a connection to a community and having social interactions are definitely needed for folks who present with these symptoms. This again can be true if it counters shame if people are experiencing guilt or shame, but it also helps if people are isolating themselves and shunning people. Reestablishing social interactions is very important, and we heal in relationships. So again, given that moral injuries are often interpersonal in nature, how do we find relationships to reheal? And part of that is that when people socially isolate for whatever reason, either to avoid people or to avoid hurting other people, this often prevents what naturally happens. Is there's this natural forgiveness that happens when we interact with others. That even when people treat us nice, that can feel like forgiveness. Even if it's not the person who we perpetrated against, right? So this natural forgiveness is, interrupted when people avoid going out in public. Certainly so if I'll step back for a second, so one of the research projects that I currently am doing at the EHN Guardians Gateway is I'm interviewing service users who are almost at the end of their program, their treatment at Gateway, and I'm asking them about sort of, things that have impacted their recovery or their wellness. And so interestingly, every single person to date has described that doing recreational outings or recreational events, so things like going golfing, watching a baseball game, or playing a sport, or going just to the store down the street with others, allows them or gives them this informal time to connect with the other cohort members, and how good that bonding feels. They feel connected, they're bonding. And most of them just say, before I came here, I didn't talk to anybody. I was really socially isolated. And so it just kind of feels normal again. I feel normal because they're interacting with humans. They're doing kind of normal things with other people. And essentially, it's like giving them friends, right? And I don't mean to be patronizing here in any way. It's people have been often, not around other people for many different reasons. And they talk so highly of basically, really basic interactions with humans, and that having these recreational outings is so tremendously therapeutic for them to be able to reconnect with other people in an informal setting, because they do interact with them in groups and therapy groups and workshops, but it's these informal ones that really seem to have the most impact in terms of that social connection. Spiritual support, I think, is important to incorporate. If we think about our morals, these are often based on our faith, our beliefs, or religion, and certainly not for everyone. Might not feel as, connected in terms of religious beliefs, but spiritual support more broadly can be important. And so if that's something that is important to someone, I think bringing in guidance from a spiritual leader is effective, and certainly there's research to back that part up. Something that I really haven't seen so much in the literature is about restorative justice. And again, I mentioned earlier, so as a forensic psychologist, this is something that I'm quite familiar with because it is a term regularly, or could be used more, but has been regularly studied in the criminal justice system. And essentially what it is recognizing that in crimes that there is often a harm that is caused, even if it's not interpersonal in nature, even if it's a property crime, somebody owns that property, right? So they were impacted. And so instead of focusing on punishing the perpetrator, what this theory is based in is how do we repair harm, right? In any crime, like I said, whether it's a property crime or assault or something like that, that there is a harm that is caused, and that what victims will often say is that they don't feel like they've been included, or they don't feel as engaged in the criminal justice system, and so they feel kind of left out. And so through meetings, through conversations that happen that are facilitated, this can promote healing and recovery for both the victim and the perpetrator. So if we think about that, sometimes in moral injury, what the injury comes from is that something that someone has done as the perpetrator. And so can we bring people together and focus on repairing the harm, right? And that, again, hopefully could use this model in a different population or a different group, but still have the same really effective outcomes that we see in the criminal justice system. And then the last thing I just wanted to touch on is identity. So this is often impaired in people with moral injury. And so exploring how the event or how the distress has impacted who they see themselves as, or how they see themselves in a group, is important to address. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about is this model that, again, like I said, wasn't created specifically around moral distress or moral injury, but what it was is a model that was created for public safety personnel of how to kind of do the dance back and forth between how do they protect themselves at work, and then how do they reconnect with their human self and their family and their friends and their communities after work, in a way that they can sort of do back and forth. And I think about that sometimes people work in environments where there are many morally challenging or morally stressful events happening every day. And so how do we protect ourselves more proactively? And so I don't have a ton of time to explain sort of the model, but I would strongly encourage you to check it out as a more proactive way to consider. Part of it is what are some strategies that folks can do to disconnect at work? And this is not about not being a human or turning people into robots, but sort of emotionally disconnecting a little bit in order to be more functional and to create some distance between themselves and what the actions they're doing. And so an example of this we see already is, things like Black humor, or even just humor itself. So in many studies on healthcare in moral injury, but also in public safety personnel, both groups have described that humor helps them get through difficult events at work. Also, both in healthcare and in public safety personnel jobs or in the military. Another task that I often encourage people to try out is thinking, they call it being task oriented. I think about it as like putting kind of like your scientist hat on, because there are some things that we do, let's say as a healthcare provider, that could be described as perhaps gross or gruesome or difficult. And how do we just focus on what the task is, right? So we're, I don't know, sewing someone's leg up, right? If we really think about that, it can be kind of gross. I mean, I'm not that kind of doctor, but to me, that feels kind of gross. But if we just focus on, okay, I have to actually put stitches in this person's leg, the being task focused, being the scientist in the moment can help you so that you're not thinking about either the gruesome part of it, or you're also not thinking about that this is a 12-year-old boy and how did he get that injury, and keeping you disconnected from the emotional part in the moment. Now, of course, after they do talk about reconnection, and so there's tasks there that are needed to reconnect so that again, we can process things, we can access emotions, we can connect with other people, but it is a dance to go back and forth. So again, I'll leave that there, but I do strongly encourage you to check out this report. Okay, so I think I've left enough time for questions there. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and welcome certainly comments or feedback.
Amazing. Well, first of all, I want everybody to hit the reaction button at the top and give a big round of applause to Dr. Martin. This was a fantastic, fantastic presentation. So thank you so, so much for that. Um, and let's go to our Q&A bar. I'm going to do my level best to get through all of our questions today, but we actually have quite a few, which is really, really, really exciting. So we're going to start off, and for folks who are putting their hands up, really, really appreciate it. Best to add your question to the Q&A or to the chat. So let's start from the bottom. Now we're here. We have a question from Heather. Would addictive behaviors and afterwards shame classify as moral distress?
I mean, I think so, right? So particularly if a person sees their drug use as going against their morals, then then afterwards that the following emotions, feeling guilty or feeling shame, they're the perpetrator. Like I said, moral distress can happen when someone else does something, or certainly when you do something. So I do think that you can experience moral distress when you've done something that goes against your morals, for sure.
Awesome, awesome. We next have a question from Nicole. So when you stated that it shows up, I'm guessing moral injury, more prevalently in more junior members of service rather than veteran members, is there a certain window or time frame that you're seeing, for example, first 3 years of service, first 5?
So I'm not quite sure. This isn't research that I've done personally, but their sort of outcomes were just that as that people are reporting less moral injury as they are increasing in rank in the military. But yeah, it's not research that I've done, so I'm not exactly sure what they found.
Okay, awesome. Would you consider, and this is a question from Health Outreach, so would you consider people who are victims of human trafficking as forced to do unthinkable things as being exposed to moral injury?
Yeah, so absolutely, right? So I mean, I would think that's also traumatic in nature. Um, and I didn't say this earlier that, events can be both traumatic and morally injurious or potentially morally injurious, but to be morally injurious, they don't have to be traumatic, right? So it could be something that is less severe in nature. If you look at the actual definition of trauma exposure, let's say in the DSM, but absolutely, I think victims of what you're describing would be for sure exposed to a potentially morally injurious event.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dr. Martin. We got lots of questions. This is great. You good to keep going?
Awesome.
Amazing. So next we have a question from Tanya. I'm wondering if having an adult child with addictions would impact a mother/family with a moral injury, setting those hard boundaries and witnessing the trauma they are experiencing over the years with the inability to help.
Absolutely, right? I mean, it is so difficult, I think, as family members to figure out how do we best support, someone who has addictions or other mental disorders. Do we give people money? Do we not give them money? How do we support them, right? So this is something that is close to my heart and my own family, and so I think it's making hard choices. Putting up boundaries, I do think that is challenging towards our morals for sure, and so I think that is morally stressful for sure.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Next, we have a question from Jenna, and I'm seeing like a bit of a trend with like definition. Do you
Okay.
see value in having MI, I'm guessing moral injury, as a DSM diagnosis in order to access insurance coverage and enhance treatment? There's that balance between not pathologizing something, but if we do, some people can then access care.
Absolutely. I mean, this is part of the reason why there's been so much debate about the actual diagnosis. I think right now the closest that I've seen is people calling it a syndrome, right? So a syndrome meaning
Mm,
just a handful of symptoms that all happen at the same time. And I just was at a conference on the weekend, the CPA conference, and they were talking about that when presented with a definition, or not definition, a case study of describing someone with a moral injury, that many clinicians are actually diagnosing this as PTSD. and whether that is because there is some definition shift or drift, if you want to call it, or people because they are trying to access people or give people access to support.
Hmm.
So this is happening. I'm not sure whether I would put it in the DSM, but I do think that if we look at the evolution of the diagnosis of even PTSD, the latest one does cover things, cover shame, which was, other symptoms, and the umbrella sort of is growing. And so whether or not this becomes part of the umbrella, I'm not sure, but we do see the definition of PTSD growing. And I do think that absolutely there is a need for people to have access to services. So, this becomes an insurance issue more than even a clinical one.
Very interesting. Next, we have a question from Yvonne. What is the best practice in encouraging people who may be experiencing moral injury to seek help, especially when they may not be making the connection between the event and the symptoms?
I think, it's giving people language. Like I said, most people aren't aware of this term. So I do think that helping people to help them with that link that perhaps they're missing, giving language to things, defining their experience and giving a label for something perhaps would direct people then to access services based on the label that we've been able to provide them with what they're experiencing.
Amazing. Next, just a few more, but thank you so much everyone for your awesome participation. This really makes Q&A and the webinars even more fun. Next question from Darlene. Within spiritual support, identifying life values and what makes life important, what helps guide important decision-making moments?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Hmm.
I mean, I do think that values work is really important, and so that may fall under, spiritual, guidance. And certainly, things like acceptance and commitment therapy focus a lot on values work. There's an exercise that I give a lot of my clients called the values card sort. So you could just Google that, where it asks clients to sort of rate their values and then kind of prioritize them. So I do think values work comes in here, but essentially that is the part that has been impaired or injured often, right? So it's helping clients to, hold on to values, but also recognize that, their injury comes from something, is because something has been violated in terms of their values or morals often.
Awesome. And Darlene has confirmed that that was in fact the question. So you did even a better job, Dr. Martin. Thank you so
Okay.
much. Um, we have just a few minutes left, and I see a couple more questions, and we'll round off. So from Cherie, please forgive me if I mispronounce your name. Do you have a list of examples, or could you refer us to a list of moral injury and distress, I guess, symptoms?
I think the best resource that I can find that's out there is for people to go to the Atlas Institute, which is out of Ottawa. And we can hopefully, Jonathan, you can send out this link when we follow up with folks, but they
Absolutely.
do their moral injury has been a priority for them in terms of research. They have a guideline that came out for healthcare specifically, but also I think for public safety recently. But even if you're not serving folks in those occupations, in these guidelines or in these reports that they have published, which are all free and you can find online, they go into great detail about definitions, symptoms, examples, and intervention ideas. So I would highly encourage people to go, check out the Atlas Institute.
Amazing. Couple more. You mentioned You mentioned strategies to assist with managing moral injury. Do you feel that a full recovery can occur, or is it just manageable?
I think people can recover. I think that while there are some really, really difficult experiences that people may have, I do think it's possible. Humans are very resilient, like I said. It doesn't mean that, the event or the exposure will be thought of in a good way, or it might still mean that people experience distress. But when we think about what recovery is, recovery is not, not experiencing a ton of distress.
Hmm.
It's being functional in those moments. And so I think all of these are going to be bad memories, but I think the amount of distress and functional impairment that people experience can recover for sure.
Fantastic. So everyone, I want to thank Dr. Martin again so much for this amazing presentation. Feel free to, show your applause with the react button at the top. I did want to highlight, I know we have some fantastic clinicians and healthcare professionals in the audience, as per usual with our webinars. It's been highlighted to me by our HR department that we're actually in need of nurses and clinicians in Rockies and BC. So if you or anyone you know is looking for some amazing work for an amazing company, you feel free to email your resume or ask questions at hiring@ehncanada.com. And bonus points if you say that Jonathan sent you. And I know Tammy will be really happy. But I thank you so much, everyone, for coming out to the presentation today. Thank you, Dr. Martin, and we will see you next time. Take care,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.